that in fact they were doing internal studies that showed just the opposite, that this foam had an environmental impact, that it wasn't biodegradable, and that in fact it did show signs of linkages to some serious uh, health effects. And as the understanding of this chemical came to light, uh, people started to get more cautious about its use, to the point that now they shut down the firefighter training site as of 2004, and the practice has been discontinued there. There's still similar types of firefighter training that go on, but they've been moved to a different type of facility where the chemicals are contained, and a different type of chemical is now used. The site itself at the St. John's Airport in 2004, when they discontinued, Transport Canada owns the site. So Transport Canada understood that now it had a contaminated site, that it had to do certain things in respect of. So it got environmental engineers involved, and they started doing various steps of remediation. They extracted a significant number of soils from the site and backfilled it in with clean soil. They tested the groundwater beneath the site so that they could get an understanding of what was there. And based on the advice of their environmental engineers, they were advised that because of what was found in the groundwater, they had to get a sense of where that groundwater was moving. And they started monitoring the migration of that groundwater. Meantime, they also had to publish that, in fact, they were dealing with a contaminated site.
And they did that through what's called the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory. So it's a public database that you can go on, and effectively you can find all the contaminated sites that are on the federal government's books across the country, and the state of what the state is, what the type of contaminant is, how much has been spent on remediation of the site. And so this is the entry with respect to the site that we're concerned about here. It's called the Disposal Site 2 and Fire Training Area. You'll notice that, in terms of classification, it's a high priority for action. According to the federal government right now, the site is active, and they identify this as where it is, and they're working on it. So you probably can't see this very well on the back, but essentially, this is the airport. This is the location of the firefighter training site. This is the Pine Ridge Creek subdivision just beyond. And the issue that they've had is that they needed to get an understanding of how much of this has now migrated into here and potentially beyond into potable water well sources. Now, just kind of a bigger view of this, this is the town of Torbay, or a portion of the town of Torbay. Again, the airport down here, little star is where the former firefighter training site is located. And this big red line is something that you might be familiar with now, because this is sort of the boundary for the purposes of the class action that we've identified. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later as well, about how we define that area. But essentially, this is the area, this is the scene of the action. At this point in the story, I'll just tell you a little bit more about PFAS. So PFAS they're a family of human manufactured, stable, what we call fluorinated synthetic chemicals. And the fluorine is the key in this. They're effectively made up of a chain of fluorine atoms along a carbon chain. And a fluorine carbon in the world of chemistry is an extremely strong, stable chain, very hard to break down. And that's in fact why it was originally manufactured. This was originally manufactured in the 1930s, at first for military applications. Then after the Second World War, the chemical companies that were involved in producing this looked for, obviously, other applications, and they came up with a whole slew of applications for this stuff. One of the most commonly known ones is Teflon. Anything, but really it's applications of anything where you want something not to stick to something else, right? So you see it in a lot of things like Scotch guarding, where you don't want something to stain a fiber. You see it in a lot of rain gear, where you want applications where the water is just going to run right off. And in the same sense, in this application, it's the nature of its use in this firefighting foam is that obviously it can withstand intense heat and not break down, and still keep that bond to essentially smother a fire and keep it from spreading. So the issue becomes when if you're not properly sort of containing PFAS, once they enter the environment, they can cause extensive and long-lasting environmental contamination, due in fact to their characteristics of being soluble and mobile and persistent. They're readily absorbed in human tissues after they've been ingested. And again, they're extremely stable and persistent once they've been ingested. And they're resistant to metabolic degradation. So to unpack what that really means, it means that when we drink it, it goes into our body. Typically, it moves its way eventually into our bloodstream, and it stays there. It is very hard to remove. It's not something that your body can naturally process. And so in the world of PFAS, you often hear people talk about bioaccumulation, which means that the more PFAS you consume, the more you're just combining to what you've already consumed, and you have a body burden, is what they refer to it as, of PFAS in your body. So the critical thing here is that, I'll be talking to you a little bit about the amount of PFAS that we're talking about. And a lot of people will say, this is a very minuscule amount, and why are we so concerned about this? The current level of PFAS that Health Canada is concerned about is 30 nanograms per liter.
And I, like you, when I first heard that term, I had no
What the heck is a nanogram per liter?
how much is that. All I know is it's really small.
It is an extremely small amount. And Health Canada is saying, really, there's no safe level of PFAS in drinking water. It should be zero, right, if we want to have healthy water. But we're PFAS, they are toxic. They're considered to be toxic. They have been characterized as toxic by the federal government now. They have been studied over the past, particularly over the past 20 years, and they have been linked to various different adverse health effects in humans, including testicular cancer, kidney cancer, liver damage, autoimmune and endocrine disorders, preeclampsia, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, and a whole host of other very serious health impacts. So government agencies, regulators, the scientific community, they've concluded that PFAS are human health hazards, that they present a substantial danger when released into the environment. And this is giving way to a whole host of different types of litigation going on across the country. In Canada, it's relatively new, but what I can say is that the US experience is probably a decade beyond ours, predominantly because most of these chemicals were actually manufactured in the United States. And so there are a lot of instances of contamination close to where these chemicals were actually manufactured, which has given rise to litigation. In Canada right now, some of the litigation that's going on is actually provincial governments that are bringing suit directly against the manufacturers of these chemicals because they are identifying that because of what these manufacturers didn't tell us about what they actually knew about the environmental impact and the health consequences, that it's led to a whole host of liabilities, particularly public water systems, like municipal treated water systems. A lot of these systems now across the country are needing upgrades to account for how to deal with PFAS, which are very expensive upgrades. And so provinces are bringing suit directly against manufacturers saying, it's because of your actions that we are now having to incur these costs. And frankly, a lot of these manufacturers, a lot of these things aren't going to trial. The manufacturers have been settling a lot of these claims. And there's an aspect of that type of approach that's going to become a live issue in our case as well. Government's understanding and the scientific community's understanding of the health effects of this stuff has improved over time. There's been a refinement of the drinking water standards with respect to PFAS and the way that government goes about trying to regulate it. So at one point in time, the federal government had concluded that it would regulate two types of PFAS that are commonly referred to, their acronyms PFOA and PFOS. And government thought that a relatively safe level would be 600 nanograms per liter for one of these and 200 nanograms per liter for the other. And that was sort of the standard for a long period of time, including the period of time that Transport Canada was monitoring the migration of this stuff away from the firefighter training site. So for a long period of time, essentially the better part of a decade, leading up to 2023, Transport Canada it had environmental engineers that were looking at the groundwater here and taking samples and monitoring the amount of PFAS in the water. The issue was that at the time, those environmental engineers were saying, well, what is considered to be the healthy level? 600 nanograms per liter, 200 nanograms per liter. What we are finding is below that, so it's negligible. We don't have to be concerned about it. It's below what Health Canada is telling us is safe. But as Health Canada's understanding became better, it said we've got to look at this in a different light. We have to look at this in a different way. We're going to need to change our standards. They have to become much more stringent. And in fact, that's what Health Canada decided to do. In 2023, Health Canada started down the path of saying we've got to tighten the screws on these regulations. 600 nanograms per liter, 200 nanograms per liter, it's no longer safe. In fact, we understand that it is not safe at those levels, and so we're going to have to change it. And they started down a path towards a new standard. That standard now is 30 nanograms per liter. So they went down considerably. And the 30 nanograms per liter isn't just applicable to those two types that I referred to, PFOA and PFOS. It's applicable to 25 different types of PFAS. If you have a concentration of 25 different types of PFAS in your water and it adds up to 30 nanograms per liter, that's too much. And look, government of Canada isn't the only one doing this. The same type of process is happening in countries throughout the world. The Environmental Protection Agency in the United States has gone through the same thing. It, at one point in time, considered, again, 600 nanograms per liter, 200 nanograms per liter for PFOA and PFOS. They revised those down to 4 nanograms per liter for each one. So it's a significant difference. Now, when we think of that in practical terms, like I was just saying, what was once considered negligible now, you look at it now in light of the 30 nanograms per liter, and it's an exceedance, right? And now suddenly Transport Canada has to say, we can't treat that as negligible. We actually have to treat that as a true contaminant, and we have to figure out what to do with it. So, you can easily go online and you're going to see all kinds of headlines about PFAS out there and different things going on. 3M knew that this stuff was toxic. Documents show, Canada's adding PFAS, which is linked to cancer and other problems, to the toxic substances list. Oftentimes you hear about hotspots for PFAS. And of course, the hotspots for PFAS that we know about across the country are commonly airports, military bases, anywhere where there would have been that AFFF foam used in the course of firefighter training. The other thing I should add here, just while I'm talking about the chemical PFAS, is that all the while the knowledge about the effect of this stuff was improving, also people were getting better accustomed to the nature, its characteristics. So the understanding about how it actually travels in groundwater became better known. So what we can say about that is that it's known now that PFAS can move through a groundwater system for kilometers downstream, several kilometers downstream from where it was originally deposited. It has this ability that is different than other chemicals in terms of the way that it can actually move through a groundwater system. The other thing is that commonly it doesn't always move to create a single plume. So when we talk about like a hydrocarbon, like an oil spill, oftentimes characteristically the oil will spill, but it will generate a single plume. And if you can identify the plume and deal with the single plume, well, then you can rest relatively assured that you're dealing with the issue. PFAS doesn't quite work that way. Oftentimes it can be deposited at a site like this. It can then leach into the soils and then into the groundwater below. But it can also be carried by surface level streams to create plumes further downstream. So, oftentimes when site assessments are done of PFAS contamination, you find that there are multiple plumes throughout a groundwater system. And identifying one doesn't necessarily mean that you have the situation under control. So Transport Canada knew of all this, obviously. They knew of what Health Canada was doing, and was gaining itself this better understanding of its contaminated sites and what they could rely on, what they couldn't. One of the things that we've been doing since November of last year, when we initially launched the class action, is we've been sending out lots of access to information requests to the federal government, to the town of Torbay, to the Provincial Department of Environment. And we've been doing it, getting back lots of different records. We have hundreds of pages of environmental engineering reports that primarily have been completed by consultants of both the Transport Canada and the town, sometimes at the insistence of the Department of Environment of the province. And one of the nuggets that we were able to obtain through access to information was a memorandum to the Deputy Minister of Transportation, which was set out in December of 2023. And what this was all about is, again, Transport Canada understood that it had all these contaminated sites across the country. It understood that Health Canada was going to be bringing down that PFAS level from, in one case, 600 nanograms per liter down to 30. And it said, what are we going to do about this? We're aware of this. Are we going to wait for provinces to implement this into their drinking water standards? Or are we going to take a proactive approach? And, luckily, they decided they would take a proactive approach. But through this memo that we've been able to find, we see the statements that are essentially recognizing that this is what they need to do. Transport Canada will need to adhere to the finalized PFAS objective on federal lands, and will use it proactively in the absence of provincial and territorial PFAS standards. So we're not waiting for the province to catch up. Transport Canada needs to determine if it will adopt the proposed PFAS objective now to prevent the possible consumption of PFAS contaminated drinking water, or wait until the PFAS objective is finalized. They also say things like, it's also recommended that Transport Canada use the proposed PFAS objective in investigations underway in place of the current drinking water guidelines. The proposed PFAS objective will result in new detections and exceedances at greater concentrations. So again, they understood the problem. They understood that if we adopt where Health Canada is going, it means that sites that otherwise we were saying have negligible amounts on them are no longer negligible. And what are we going to do? luckily, you know, the recommendation that they had internally was we have to adopt this right now. We can't wait for anybody else to take this on. If Health Canada is telling us that it's not safe, it's not safe, and we need to adopt this for purposes of managing the contaminated sites that we have. And so they approved that recommendation and they started moving forward. That's December of 2023. So now the question is, well, what happened in 2024? In 2024, I still remember it. I was sitting in my office one day. I get this email come up from Eddie Shear. I say, I know Eddie Shear. He's that weather guy on TV. I didn't otherwise know him. I think we have a couple of common friends and that sort of thing, but I hadn't really spoken to Eddie before. And Eddie said, Alex, a strange thing has happened to me. Transport Canada came by. They had knocked on my door and they sought my consent to test my well. And so I said, yeah, go ahead. And they tested my well and they came back and now they've just handed me the results. And the results say I'm in exceedance of Health Canada standards and they're going to be giving me bottled drinking water for a while. And so I said, well, that's interesting. Can you send me off the correspondence that they sent you? Yeah. So I'm reviewing the correspondence and it's as Eddie said. And, you know, I'm left kind of scratching my head saying, you know, why is Transport Canada testing for Health Canada standards? What's Transport Canada got to do with any of this? Because in the, you know, these notices and the consent that was sent to Eddie, there was no mention of the fact of a firefighter training site. There was no mention of the fact that we've been monitoring the groundwater to determine the migration of PFAS into that groundwater system. It was just, we're taking a precautionary approach. Health Canada's decreasing the standard and we'd like to know if it's in your well. So we started digging and, you know, lo and behold, you know, easily to find that this is a federal contaminated site index site, that one of the things that they're concerned about is PFAS in the water and that they've been monitoring this thing for years. And it's not only Eddie, obviously. You know, they had started knocking around on doors, getting a sense that, yes, there is widespread, you know, PFAS contamination in this groundwater system. So we started talking about it. We started talking to residents that were being tested that had this similar problem. And we identified early on that, you know, the only way that we're going to be able to seek redress here, because again, there was no commitment in terms of what Transport Canada was prepared to do about this. All they were doing as an interim measure was going to be providing bottled drinking water until they could figure out what was going on. So we said, this really sounds like a case where, you know, you have all these people that are dealing with the same thing. It's going to give rise to a class action because ultimately, you know, Transport Canada has an obligation here. It needs to get to the bottom of it, and people are being detrimentally affected. So the part of the story that you're probably familiar with is that then one phase of testing by Transport Canada led to another phase and led to another phase and another phase until, you know, the entire Pine Ridge Creek subdivision, all the wells have been tested. And lo and behold, you know, there are houses that have exceedances, over 30 nanograms per liter. There are houses there that have PFAS concentrations that are hundreds of nanograms per liter. There are houses there, though, that are right along next door that on the day that they were sampled are below 30 nanograms per liter. And then, so we started, you know, getting this correspondence in as well. And we said, this doesn't make sense, that Transport Canada is saying to one homeowner, you're above 30 nanograms per liter, for the time being, stop drinking the well water, and we're going to provide you with bottled drinking water. For the resident who's right along next door, who may have been tested a week or two later, and the results come back below 30 nanograms per liter, Transport Canada is telling those people that, no, carry on using your drinking water. There's no health concerns related with your drinking water. Now we said, like, you know, that's not quite right. You know, a groundwater system is a mobile system. It's an integrated, very complex system, geological system. And so there's been tests, there's been retesting. Some of the retests have, you know, borne out that the sample testing is a snapshot in time. that if you test in the spring versus in the winter, you might come up with different results. If you test before a significant weather event versus after a significant weather event, you might have different results. And so there's no certainty with respect to where this is, how it moves about, and the only way of really compelling the federal government to get some certainty on this and start treating it the way that it needs to be treated is to file a lawsuit. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, we're always cautious about the class actions that we take on. And we're cautious about assessing the evidence and saying, what is the nature of the claim? What is the case that we can prove? At this point in time, the case that we're looking at is really about the fact that you all are entitled to have clean drinking water, right? And that the fact now that you have a contaminant in your potable groundwater source is an impact to your homes. It's an impact to the marketability of your homes. It's an impact to the property value of your homes. It could mean that you are going to have to incur cost to deal with this PFAS contamination so that it's healthy drinking water again. It may be that you're going to have to incur costs of ensuring that whatever that system is that you're going to have in place is going to continue to work. So that means it's going to have to be maintained and monitored in the future, which comes with cost. And then on top of that, you're all considered, you're experiencing stress and anxiety and distress about this situation, right? And all of that has to do with the fact that this activity happened on this site and that it migrated through the groundwater into the groundwater that supplies your drinking water wells. So we understood in November that a class action is really the way that we need to go here. We also had sort of this awareness based on the fact that there are a number of public resources available that help inform the situation. So, for example, the water resource portal of the Water Resource Management Division of the provincial government, they have a great resource that's available online where they've actually mapped sort of the groundwater flows that have been studied around the province. And so the understanding is that, and I put these blue lines in because you can't see the red lines that government put on there themselves. But effectively, from the firefighter training site that's here, the groundwater takes two different paths. In one sense, it moves along what's called the Kennedy Brook catchment area, sort of to the northeast, and then it also moves more so to the north towards South Pond. And many of you may know South Pond is a pond that the town of Torbay had hoped at one point in time to use as a water source for the municipality. It unfortunately is contaminated beyond that use because of, in part, the PFAS concentration in it. The other thing that's publicly available, that was available to us while we were studying this case, was in 2015, the town of Torbay had gone out and had environmental engineers prepare a very good municipal groundwater flow modeling study. And so what they did is they went around, they considered the boundaries of the town, and they wanted to know what are the distinct groundwater systems throughout the town. And the environmental engineers identified that there are 6 distinct catchment areas in the town. And of course, the catchment areas that we are interested in then are Area 1 and Area 3. Because these are ultimately, if the firefighter training site being here at the headland of both of these catchment areas, and knowing what we know from the Water Resource Management Division, we know that the groundwater flows into these 2 areas. And so, it's the Kennedy Brook catchment area and the South Pond catchment area that are the areas of concern here. Amazingly, to the north here is the North Pond catchment area. North Pond is used as a water source for the municipality, and it is not contaminated. And the reason why it's not contaminated is because these geologists understand, the makeup of the ground system here, that there's a natural berm that exists between South Pond and North Pond that is protecting North Pond, and it's doing a reasonably good job at doing so. So we understood all this public information at the time in November when we said, we're going to launch this class action. At the time, this was sort of the footprint that we were looking at, and we were saying, well, what do we know? We know where the source of the contamination is. We know that, by the well testing that's gone on in the subdivision, we know it's been detected there. We knew from the nature of the groundwater that having detected it here and here, and with Transport Canada carrying on its investigation, that eventually they would have to test, along Blackburn Crescent, up Pine Line, Jackburn Arena, obviously. And so we said, look, reasonably, we anticipate it's got to be at least as far as this, all the while knowing that it could be potentially more extensive. And then, as I said, we started gathering more information. And the information that we gathered through a couple of different means, meeting with government officials, but predominantly through the access information requests, we gained a better understanding such that effectively we gained a better understanding of the groundwater system. More testing has been done by Transport Canada in the interim time, so that really this is sort of, in just very general terms, this is sort of the area that they've done sampling so far. They've also sort of started doing some sampling at the outflow of South Pond, people that are downwater from South Pond. And we understand the way that the groundwater, again, just from public resources, the way that the groundwater flows through that area. And that ultimately the people like yourselves that find themselves in this area, that are using the groundwater as their potable water source, are left with uncertainty, right? Because what we know is, there was multiple decades of release of PFAS here. We know it's been detected here and here. We know that a proper, what they call delineation study, hasn't been done by Transport Canada to determine the extent to which it has moved through the system. And we also know the monitoring that was done in this area over the decade preceding 2023, that it routinely showed PFAS in the water in excess of Health Canada's standard. Actually, in most cases it was either double or triple what Health Canada considers now to be a safe level. So, we looked at this and we said, ultimately, the uncertainty impacts people as well. The fact that there hasn't been a proper delineation study impacts people like yourselves. If you're a property that, has only been recently added to the boundary of the class, you're left with uncertainty as to whether or not there is PFAS in your water, if there's been PFAS in your water, if there could be PFAS in your water 6 months from now. And ultimately what we're saying is that Transport Canada owes you a duty of care to properly, timely, completely, and effectively investigate those questions and give you information. That involves environmental engineers specifically tasked, with that. A couple of times already in the presentation, I've referred to the monitoring wells that they had, and so this is taken from one of the reports in 2023. I've added the coloring of, FTA. This is the firefighter training site. The yellow dot there is a deep water monitoring well that the engineers had installed and then monitored annually for PFAS concentrations, among other contaminant concentrations, what they were looking for. And what I've shaded in red there is just the very edge of the subdivision. So the location of that deep water aquifer monitoring well and the subdivision is less than 100 meters. One of Transport Canada's consultants in 2023 was asked to sort of consolidate a lot of this information. And so they did tables for WW3 is the deep water monitoring well that we were just talking about. This is kind of the PFAS that they found in the water at the time. And I've just highlighted at the top there, you can see, 2012, in July 2012, and September 2012, and then November 2012, December 2012, June 2013. So these are all the dates of when they went in to sample that. And what these indicate, you also have to consider the different measurements of these chemicals at times. Sometimes they're expressed in nanograms per liter, other times it's micrograms per liter. But here, this amount, 0.03 micrograms per liter, is equivalent to 30 nanograms per liter. This is another type of PFAS, 20 nanograms per liter. So, when this sample came out at that deep water well, it was showing, 50 nanograms per liter. You do the math. And, it just carried on 2012, 2017, 2018, 2019. In 2019, you'll see up here, 6-2 fluorotelmer sulfonic acid. It's another type of PFAS that they only were able to start testing for in 2019. And so as soon as they started testing for it in 2019, look at what you have. You have at least, in 2019 in June, 40, that's 42 nanograms per liter of that type of PFAS alone. Add that to, the others, and you're getting up around, 100 nanograms per liter. These three types of PFAS are within that group of 25 that I was referring to earlier, that now, is the sum total when you're considering Health Canada's new objective of 30 nanograms per liter. So what else have we been doing? We've met with the Department of Environment, with the Deputy Minister there and Assistant Deputy Minister as well. We brought forward our concerns. As we were learning more and more about the situation, we would write to the department and say, look, we've got major concerns here, and Department of Environment, we need your assistance in holding Transport Canada accountable to this and what needs to be done. And one of the things that we brought to the department is we said, look, they're just doing individual drinking water well tests. They are not doing a comprehensive environmental site assessment. They are not doing a full-scale hydrogeological study. That needs to be done if we're going to understand where this is, where the plumes are, where it moves, what the delineation is, mobility, stability. And that, I've had experience prior to this in dealing with management of environmental, spills, mostly in the hydrocarbon context. So I'm well aware of, if it's an oil company that has an oil spill, these are the types of studies that they would be required to do to ensure that it's being properly cleaned. So we brought all that forward to the Department of Environment. The Department of Environment shared our concerns. They sort of see the world as we do in most respects. They are a bit wary of the fact that as a provincial government, they need to be aware of their lines of what they're able to do and what they're not able to do with respect to the federal government and jurisdiction to direct the federal government to do different things. But they share the concern. And so in March, they wrote to the town of Torbay, essentially saying, our Water Resource Management Division has those concerns that the current private well testing area may not encompass the entire area that's potentially impacted by a contaminant plume. A risk assessment should be undertaken to fully delineate the area at risk of impacts to human health. A full hydrogeological assessment should also be completed to assess the current extent of the contamination, as well as future impacts or changes to the contamination plume due to such factors as climate change, i.e. the effects on the PFAS contamination with lower or higher precipitation rates. This hydrogeological assessment should also include predictive modeling to determine the effects of additional unserviced development in areas of known contamination, areas with potential contamination, and areas adjacent to the contamination to ensure all scenarios are addressed. So it's saying, look, it agrees with us. This is the type of assessment that needs to be done. Town, you need to take this under advisement. The town of Torbay considered that. They said, yep, we agree with that. We endorse these recommendations. They sent them on to Transport Canada and said, Transport Canada, we're asking you to follow through with this. Transport Canada acknowledged receipt of that, said they're taking it under advisement for the remainder of their 2025-2026 season, and we haven't heard anything else. So, we have a sense of what needs to be done. we have a sense of what Transport Canada's duty is to all of you in terms of actually investigating it properly. We've heard rumblings about some of the work that they have planned, which, you know, it doesn't say that that's what they're gonna do, but they may be considering that, in fact, they have a duty to do this. And the primary point here is that it's a duty to investigate at this stage, right? There's an issue around remediation as well, but properly, we can't even talk about remediation is informed by proper study, right? They need to do the investigation to understand the problem before they can figure out what it is that they're gonna do to address the problem. So that's the line that we are pushing with Transport Canada. That ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, there has to be a full hydrogeological study to determine the delineation and mobility and stability and migration and risk profile of the PFAS contamination. Now, Transport Canada's responsibilities in this, you know, I've already covered what those are. So it's timely, complete, and effective warning, investigation, and remediation. And we're saying that ultimately, through the class action, we're saying Transport Canada is failing in these regards. It's not properly warning people, it's not properly informing people about the source of the PFAS, about what they knew about its migration over time, not properly informing people about the uncertainty that exists as to where it is in the groundwater system. They're obviously not doing a proper investigation that they need to. And we've been saying from the outset that, you know, a proper precautionary approach here would have been to recognize the situation, the full scale of the situation, recognize that there's all this uncertainty that exists, say to everybody that's using the groundwater as their potable water source that we are going to be providing you with bottled drinking water until we get to the bottom of this question, and that for the time being, stop drinking that water. That would have been a proper precautionary approach. That's not what they've done here. Instead, they've said, we will go in and test, and where we find the succeedants, we'll provide bottled drinking water. That's, in our view, it's wholly inadequate, and it doesn't meet their responsibility. So, faced with this, you know, I won't bore you too much with the particulars about how we characterize this in law, but just to say that in bringing forward the lawsuit, the statement of claim is linked, and you can read it at your leisure on the webpage. The way that we characterize this type of tort, essentially, is that it's characterized as a nuisance in one sense. It's characterized as negligence, trespass, a breach of certain statutory duties that Transport Canada would have under the Newfoundland Environmental Protection Act and under the federal Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And then there's another branch of liability called strict liability that we're also saying that Transport Canada runs afoul of. And then, like I said earlier, because of these failures by Transport Canada, they've caused damage. And the damage has been a diminution of the market value of these properties. There are people that have been trying to list their homes for sale, only to have those sales fall apart on environmental diligence. So it affects the marketability of the home. It also will affect the price of the home, right? Even in a situation of redress, a home that otherwise was not known to have any contaminant in the groundwater, even if you have the best filtration system on the planet to address, you know, contaminant in the water, it's still going to have an impact on whether or not somebody's going to want to buy that house. And so we're aware of that, and we're saying, you know, that's something that needs to be redressed. That is not going to be appropriately redressed by Transport Canada coming in and saying, oh, here's a filtration system, and, you know, that's that, and away we go. You know, as I said, there's going to be costs to incur. If you end up with one of these filtration systems, there are filtration systems that Transport Canada has been looking at, some of which I will say are promising in terms of the results that they're able to achieve. I think it's actually quite encouraging, but they are not inexpensive. They have to be configured to each individual property and the type of water, the mineral content of the water coming into the house. Each one of these runs about, it's about a $10,000 cost to install. And then the real kicker is the maintenance that has to go on. That these filters, they're calibrated to a certain amount of water flowing through them. And once that water has flown through them, then they have to be replaced. And this isn't like a Brita filter, right? These things they essentially have the appearance of two very large, they're called granulated carbon filters. And these are very large, industrial size filters. To replace those filters, a typical household would, based on the specs that we've seen, a typical household of 4 would have to switch out one of those filters, probably somewhere in the realm of every 1.5 to 1 3/4 years, at a price tag that appears to be somewhere around $2,500, right? And so that's, just think about it. That's going to be the cost in perpetuity of getting you clean drinking water through a filter program. Hopefully it can get you from whatever the PFAS is in the water, or that might show up in the water, down to 0, but it comes at a significant cost. And then there's testing costs as well, just to ensure that the thing is actually working, right? But again, it's something that Transport Canada is looking into to say, can this be part of the redress? Is it a short-term solution while they're considering a long-term solution? We don't know. The town of Torbay has been pretty consistent in saying that it only really sees one true viable solution here, and that's actually to get on with development of another municipal water source, right? And to get everybody hooked up to a municipal water source, and that would be the remedy, that would be the only true ability to relieve the uncertainty that will exist with respect to this groundwater system. They may be right, but again, I would just say no one's going to know until a proper investigation is completed. So it has to be that the first step, Transport Canada should do a full-scale hydrogeological assessment, and then after that, based on what is discovered, that can inform what the proper remediation will be, what the cost of that will be, and what even just the simple economics will dictate the best course of action is. In talking about damages, the other thing I wanted to stress here is that, again, this is about property value, it's about property damage, it's about clean drinking water. There's the potential that there are many people here as well that have had health effects as a result of this, or maybe at risk of developing health effects. We don't know. What we are not doing in this class of action is seeking damages for health implications. Because again, I said at the outset that we're very deliberate about the types of class actions that we take on. And we only take on the ones that we feel we have a high likelihood of success of making the case. We don't have evidence to link yet, any kind of health impacts to exposure to this in this group. Now that said, in the course of this though, in the course of gathering evidence about this, I've heard anecdotally people that will say, oh, I know somebody, or I am somebody that has had one of these health consequences on this list, and I'm curious about it, and I want to know more about it. And so we are starting to gather evidence about that, and we are still considering it. And that we're trying to be clear in pursuing this class action that we're not doing anything to prejudice anybody's right to try to seek recovery for any kind of health implications associated with this as well. But ultimately at this stage, this is about property value, property marketability, clean water source, and holding Transport Canada to their duties around ensuring that you're not adversely affected in those regards. Okay, just in terms of the process here. So we filed suit in federal court in November of last year, 2024. And what have we been doing since then? Well, like I said, we've been having meetings with government. We've been pursuing access to information requests to gather, collect evidence. The other thing that we've done, though, is we've been having case management meetings with the court and with Transport Canada's legal counsel, which in this case is the Attorney General of Canada, their office. And in the course of one of these case management meetings, Transport Canada's legal counsel said, we are interested in bringing a third-party claims in this case. And what does that mean? It means that Transport Canada wants to turn around and sue the manufacturers of the chemicals that were used at the site. And they identified who those were. So they said the AFFF foam that was used at the site came from two sources. It came from 3M and two companies. 3M Canada Company is the Canadian subsidiary of 3M Company in the US, which is the manufacturer. And Mueller Canada. Mueller Canada Limited, again, is the distributor for Mueller Water Products Limited, which is also an American chemical manufacturer. So, and these are the two types of AFFF that were used are light water, made by 3M, and Lorcon AFFF, made by Mueller. What does the third-party claim mean? Well, effectively, the story that I told you about manufacturers of chemicals not disclosing to the users of the chemicals what they actually knew about it, that's the case that Transport Canada wants to make against the manufacturers. And it's saying that to the extent that Transport Canada has liability to all the residents with respect to this, that it should be able to pass on some of that liability to, in this case, the manufacturers of the chemicals. Because we only used it, Transport Canada would say, at the firefighter training site, according to the directions that you gave us, according to the knowledge that you gave us. That at the time, again, it was biodegradable, it doesn't have a human health impact. So we relied on your instructions when all along you knew that those instructions were misleading, inaccurate, and in fact, false. So it's brought forward these claims. It's saying it wants to pursue these claims. Those claims are characterized as they're characterized as negligent misrepresentation and public and private nuisance is what Transport Canada claims against these manufacturers. Those are provincial common law questions, and that meant we couldn't be entertained by the federal court. It meant those issues fall outside of federal court jurisdiction. There's a process for this. The process is that it gets moved to the Supreme Court in Newfoundland and Labrador. So, you know, we had to go through that process. Third-party claims were brought forward in draft form. The court, you know, was convinced that yes, you know, Transport Canada has a genuine intent to pursue these claims. And as a result of that, we had to get a stay of the class proceeding in federal court and then bring a revised statement of claim in the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador. And that's the most recent step that we've taken at the end of May, is the refiling of the claim in Supreme Court. Again, the statement of claim can be viewed on the webpage. It is that statement of claim at the end of May that, again, we were able to integrate in all of the new evidence that we had obtained since November of 2024, and also expand the class. Because as we now understand it, we understand the extent of the PFAS that was distributed over a significant period of time. We understand Transport Canada's monitoring of that and detection of that in the water that was migrating towards down through the groundwater system. We also have further sampling results, and then we have all of that public knowledge with respect to the groundwater system. So based on all of that, that is the basis for us to be able to say, now this properly applies to the broader catchment area. The catchment area that's based on those water studies that were performed by the town. And that same uncertainty exists for everybody that's drawing water from that groundwater system. So that is the basis for the extension of the class boundary. We're going to post this on our website. This was a update that some of you probably received from Transport Canada, but many of you wouldn't have received yet. It just came out 2 days ago, and effectively, they understood that this was going on tonight, and so they wanted to make sure that they had something to say about what they've been doing as well. So they give this update. So they're saying that as of May of 2025, 28% of the homes that they've tested had PFAS above the Health Canada objective of 30 nanograms per liter, 28% of what they've tested. Based on the results that you've all provided us through the questionnaire, we understand that that the number of houses they've tested is somewhere in the realm of 180 to 200 houses, maybe as far as 220. But what we've seen is that percentage, that tends to be accurate. We think it's about a 28 to 30% of the homes are exceeding 30 nanograms per liter. What they won't tell you is that of all the homes, according to, again, the data that you've provided us, of all the wells that they've tested, 86% have had at least some kind of PFAS in the water, right? It's about another 30% of homes have PFAS in the water somewhere between 15 and 30 nanograms per liter. And again, they're not telling you about the inconsistencies. So again, these are just snapshots in time. If you have 30 nanograms per liter in your well one day, the next time you go to test it, it may not be 30 nanograms per liter, it might be higher, it might be lower. Hence the reason why we're being sticklers about you need to do a proper environmental site assessment of this site, Transport Canada. The next steps, a limited drinking water treatment system pilot program is to begin in the spring of 2025, and it has begun. We'll tell you a little bit more about that just momentarily. In the meantime, they're saying they're going to be resampling drinking water for the homes below 30 nanograms per liter, beginning again this spring, and that'll take place twice a year. So they're committing to going back in, and people that have tested below 30 nanograms per liter, they're going to be knocking on your door if they haven't already done so, again, to see about these inconsistencies and see if they can determine that there is relative stability or not. They reference an environmental consultant is conducting a comprehensive study to interpret sampling results in the impacted area to determine next steps. Now, does that mean they're doing a true hydrogeological study, site assessment? Doesn't really say that. We're hoping that that's what they're working towards, but they haven't really committed to that yet. And then their intention is a broader installation of treatment systems at homes exceeding PFAS anticipated for the beginning of the fall of 2025. So they have systems that they are feeling relatively confident about. These are the systems that I described to you that they have a high cost of installation and monitoring. But it seems to be that they have a relative confidence level in that. And they selected 4 homes. We know that it's 4 homes with relatively high PFAS values. And they've approached people to see if they'll participate in a pilot program. They approached people on Monday about that, with documentation associated with it. We reached out through the mailing list to see if anybody had been approached with respect to this, and we've identified the people that were. And they've been gracious enough to give us, the proposals that Transport Canada has sent out to them. And my colleague, David Eaton, has had a bit of time to review some of what it is that Transport Canada sent out. So I'll hand over the microphone to David for a few minutes, and you can tell us about what you found. Stand up over here. Sure, go for it. Oh. I broke it. Yeah. Sorry, why don't you hold it off? Put it there, see if that works. So the proposed pilot project is to install these treatment systems in the 4 homes, as Alex has mentioned. And Transport Canada plans to install and maintain these systems on a sampling basis at no charge to the people who have been selected. And while the treatment systems are being tested, they will continue to provide the bottled water to everybody as they have been doing to this point in time. And people will remain on the bottled water until the sampling of these systems proves to be effective. The plan is to put these in the basement of the homes, presumably where the water is brought into the house, and they will, therefore they will be at the entry point, and all the water then circulating through the house will be subject to the treatment that these systems provide. As Alex has mentioned, it involves 2 cylinders. They're somewhere around 3 or 4 feet high. The
treatment of water that you may currently have if you're in one of those test places will be removed, and they will install the necessary treatment for the water to work with the system. The system will be installed supposedly in accordance with all codes that apply to whatever is necessary for it. The people who have been selected will be required to grant permission to Transport Canada and its servants or agents, as it says, to enter the home for the purposes of installation and for the purposes of then sampling the water once the installation has been complete. There's a contract that will be required to be entered into, and the contract lays out that it will be in place for 5 years, which seems like it might be too long a time, but that is the horizon that they have put on it. And they propose initially to sample the water on a weekly basis as it comes out of the treatment system. It doesn't say whether or not they're going to sample the water coming in. So without knowing what the level of PFAS is as it comes into the home, there's no way of knowing what effectiveness the sampling or the system will have for that particular water. So that may be something that needs to be clarified before those contracts are completed, because it would seem to make sense to sample it on the way in, then you know what effect the system is having. The proposal to sample the water every week is proposed to go on for 2 months, and that would hopefully give them an understanding of how effective it is being. After 2 months, they would sample it at longer intervals up till the end of the first year, and then how often it would be sampled after that would depend upon the results that they receive. As Alex has already said, they're estimating for this purpose that the filters would have to be replaced annually, but that would depend on the usage that goes through the system. Any additional maintenance that would be required to operate the system during the testing period would be covered by Transport Canada. So it is proposed that it will be cost-free to the homes where this is carrying on. I guess the only downside is if they're coming into the house to take water samples every week, somebody has to be there to provide the access to get in to take the samples from hopefully the input and the output to the system. The contract can be terminated by either party on 90 days notice, so if you're one of those people and it's too intrusive or there's issues, you can terminate the contract on 90 days notice. And at the end of the contract, or when it's terminated, the system will be removed at the expense of the federal government. So it's all very positive. It may have some wrinkles in the process. Any contract of this nature, of course, requires good cooperation on both sides. And you know, if they want to get access to your property on day one and you're out of town for the next 3 days, how is that going to be worked out? But that's a practical thing that may take time to get through. So it's a positive step, and it would be a more positive step if the sampling is on both sides of this system. So we'll see how that works out. But that's the proposal for now, and hopefully if that's carried out, it will reveal important information that will be a good step forward. Don't break it again.
I'll try not to break it again. There we go. Okay. All right, so look, I've been talking at you for an hour and a half. I'm going to clue up pretty quick here now. I'm just going to tell you very quickly our anticipated next steps. You know, we've just recently filed this statement of claim to Supreme Court. We've already written to the Supreme Court as well, asking that a proper case management judge be appointed to the case. so that they can start, streamlining the process from here. Really, the next thing on the horizon for the class action is making the steps towards the certification application so that we can get the thing, certified, get a certification order. And in the meantime, asking the court to compel, if needed, Transport Canada to get on with serving, issuing and serving third-party claims on those manufacturers so that they are brought into the mix as well. We will continue to provide you with, updates in the same way that we've been doing. Typically, we're sort of doing that every, 3 months or so. We'll give you kind of a single blast update. If something arises that, we should have another one of these meetings, we're going to happily to convene another meeting. And we'll continue to use that, the mailing list as a way to contacting you. So I want to turn it over now to a question and answer period. Before I do that, there was a couple of questions that I think we've probably covered off so far of people that people have been sort of bringing to me already. I'll just address two of them right off the bat before anybody gets a chance to stand up and ask it. The question will inevitably be asked, what should I do? I haven't had my drinking water well tested. Should I be drinking the water or not? Should I be drinking bottled water? All I can say to you on that regard is that, that's a personal choice for you to make. I think the most precautionary approach that you can have is, pick up some bottled drinking water and start using that, for the next, period of time until we've got greater certainty about what's going on. But again, that's a personal choice. One of the other things that people have been asking is, in terms of the new boundary, right? It's not all that detailed. Maybe your house is right on the boundary. You can't really tell if you're in or you're out. The boundary is at the degree of specificity of what it is because it's based on those, geological studies that the town had. So we're working from the same maps. They're not all that specific. So my suggestion to you would be that if you think you're on the boundary line, for all intents and purposes, consider yourself to be within the boundary for now until Transport Canada comes along and does a proper study to tell you that you're not in the boundary, and hopefully your fears will be alleviated at some point in time that there's any kind of issue. But for the time being, I think the appropriate approach is consider yourself, if you're on the boundary and you're not sure if you're in or out of that boundary, err on the side of including yourself in the mix. And then the last one I'll get to is I've got a lot of people that are now newly finding themselves in this mix, in this boundary, and with this issue, and people are asking, can I get my well tested? And my line has been, you can approach Transport Canada and inquire about whether or not they will test your well. For the time being, I think this is new for Transport Canada as well, the expansion of the area. So I think for the next little while, likely it is, if you get a response from them, it's probably going to be a no. But I would still say it's worthwhile you asking that they test your well. If they refuse to test your well, there are a few independent laboratories around town that can conduct this sampling and can give you a result. It comes at a cost. These samples run somewhere in the realm of $300 to $500 a piece, typically when they're done. But if you're concerned and you want that peace of mind about what's in your well, at a minimum, it's something that you can do. It's a cost you can incur to get a single sample. If you decide to do that, please, I encourage you to share the results with us. We can add it to our database, and the more information we gather, the more informed we'll all be. And I would just say on that as well that, but be aware that it would give you that snapshot in time, right? If you get a test done and it's saying, I don't know, you have 5 nanograms per liter in your well, or 15 nanograms per liter in your well, it means that's what you had when that sample was taken. And it doesn't necessarily give you a better sense of, is it still that today? Is it still that tomorrow? Is it still that 3 months from today? We'll put up the names of some of those private laboratories on the webpage so that you've got some contact information for them. We will also put up on the webpage a contact number for Transport Canada so that you can approach them. Up until now, it's been Lynn Power at Transport Canada that's been the lead on that. I think that they're sort of expanding the people that are involved in it. So they, as of today, actually, they sent us a new email address that people can send inquiries to. It's sort of like a mass email address. And so we'll post that on the webpage as well if you want to send an email to them and ask about testing of your well. Third question, what if you want to just bypass all of this for now and say, you know what, I don't really care about incurring that kind of cost and putting a filtration system in my house now. If you decide to do that, you can do that. And I'm aware of at least a household that has done that already. If you decide to do that, I would say, hold on to your receipts, right? Make sure that you're tracking the costs associated with what you're installing, any measures that you're taking to remediate this situation. Hold on to your receipts, and as my colleague David says recurrently in these situations, start building your file. So what that means is, keep good records of when you did what. If you get your well tested, this is the day I got the well tested, this is what it cost, this was the results. Organize your information. If you're feeling particularly distressed about this situation, write a note, put it in the file. Because it could be at some point in time, we could be coming to you all and saying, if you've got a working file, now is the time for us to drag it out and consolidate it so that we can say to Transport Canada, this is what this actually looks like. This is the way that real people were dealing with this problem on the ground. And this is the basis for our claim for damages. This is what they're seeking recompense for. So try to keep in your mind, build your file, keep it organized, and and continue to share, particularly test results with us when you obtain them. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. We've got probably about another half hour or so for questions and answers. So there's a couple of microphones around the room, and there's a microphone here so that people can hear any questions that are asked. And I just encourage you that if you have a question, maybe raise your hand and we'll pass you the mic. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm a real estate agent.
Yep.
And the question I have is Transport Canada aware?
Yeah, but
Oh, sorry.
it's okay. Yep.
Is Transport Canada aware that while this class action lawsuit is on the go, that nobody can sell or buy their house unless they have cash?
Right.
Or over 20% because the banks will not finance the
Yeah.
property as long as it contains hazardous waste in the area?
Right.
And that's a major concern for a lot of clients I'm working with and for real estate agents in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.